Congress. Congress is the overarching term that we use to refer to the institution that includes both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Those two structures that make up Congress are where laws are made. They're the legislature. So this is where new law comes from. This is where the representatives from the states and the senators from the states come together to provide oversight, to provide budgeting, to provide actual legislation, right? So Congress is kind of the central hub of most of what U.S. government does for decision making. In our Congress, right, consisting of two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate, there are a total of 535 members. We send 2 senators from every state, so 50 states equals 100 senators. And we cap the number of House of Representative members at 435, 1907 or somewhere back in there. So that's a legislative, a law that was passed. It said this is how many we're going to have, a procedural act that was passed. Prior to that, we were extending the number of seats based on how the population expanded. That doesn't make just a whole lot of sense today because obviously we're up at 328 or so million people in the U.S. We'd have to, figure out how big we wanted the House of Representatives to be, and so instead we just locked it out, and we at 435, and we reapportion House members after every census, so that each House member is representing the same number of people. Then it's another 10 years before we redo that, and so these get a little out of whack over that 10 years, but the general idea is those House members are going to be, for the most case, except for the really smaller states, representing about the same number of people each. So not too hard. I've got here the qualifications that you have to meet demographically and legally to run for the office, to be elected to the office. I'm sorry, not run, but to be elected to the office. As you can see for the House, not that hard. 25 years old is the minimum age. You have to have been a U.S. citizen for at least 7 years, and you have to be a resident of the state you're elected in. Now that's the federal rules. There are more rules, of course, that are probably going to be applied at the state level. One of which is not only that you're a resident of the state, but that you're a resident of the House district that you're trying to be elected in, right? For the Senate, you've got to be 30 years old and a citizen for 9 years. And as a senator, you're representing your whole state. Both senators represent their whole state. So they just need to be a resident of their state. So there's not a whole lot there. Right? There's no requirement that you have never broken the law or not be a felon. There's no requirements of education. There's no test, right? The only thing besides these, and maybe a couple rules at state level, is that you win the election, right? So, we've had people that have gone to jail and then got out and got elected. We've had people that were elected that got in trouble while they were elected, gone to jail, did their time, got out and got reelected. So you just basically need to win your elections. So what's your job? Well, it's open to some interpretation what your job is. I mean, legally, you are a representative for citizens back in your state, for the voters in your state, in both of these positions. But how you choose to approach the job how you hold yourself out to your voting representative or voting citizens could be a little different, right? And so what I give you here is three different ways to view the job of a representative, whether that's House or Senate. Most of us generally think that our representatives should represent us, and so we approach this um, uncritically from the perspective of what I call a delegate perspective, and that when someone is elected to office, their job is to be a delegate for the people that elected them. In other words, go do what we tell you to do, right? We've delegated you to carry our intents, our beliefs, our preferences to government and implement them. And that's a delegate perspective. And everyone that's elected at the congressional level will, in some form or fashion, at least give lip service to the delegate perspective, because if it's a representative democracy, the idea of representation kind of requires that you know what your constituents want and try to fulfill that. It's also an element of job security, right? You're going to run for reelection. It's probably a good idea in the previous period while you've been a representative or a senator to have done what the folks that elected you wanted you to do, right? To have actually represented them. So almost all of the people that get elected are going to have this perspective informing them some, but not all. The second perspective is what I call the trustee perspective. And if you know what a trustee from a will is, then you know where this is going, right? If someone, all right, you're under age and your parents, right, both pass away, the court will appoint a trustee. And the idea is you're not old enough, you're not an adult to be making decisions for yourself. So the court's going to appoint someone who is responsible and old enough to make good decisions for you, right? Until you reach the age of consent and can make those decisions yourself. So that's the same perspective here, right? That when someone gets elected to Congress, quite often when they get there, they figure out real quick that a large majority of their work is, it's possible that it does not either impact their constituents or and or their constituents may not care about the work that they're being required to be a part of. And in that sense, then the elected individual has the opportunity to act as a trustee, right? If I'm not getting clear, direct messages from my constituents about what they want, then I'm in a position where I can do what I think is best for them, right? Without actually having to get information from them. I can say, right, I know that most of the people in my district think this. I'm not going to bother to check. I'm just going to make decisions in line with that, right? They're trusting me to make the best decisions for them. I will. And then we'll hold a referendum on whether I was making good decisions or not when we do a reelection campaign. And if they vote me out, then I obviously didn't do the job very well. So, right, you've got a House member or a Senate member that can approach this job as I'm just going to listen to what they tell me. Every time something new comes up and I need information, I'll go back to them and ask. That's the delegate perspective. Or I'll be the trustee perspective where I'll just do what I think is best and then we'll see what happens on the reelection. In fact, when you look at how elected representatives actually do their job, they do a mixture of this, right? They were elected by running on a platform for their party and for themselves as a candidate. And that platform, especially the 5, 6, 8 big issues that they argued their position on that they think were persuasive, they're going to vote that way, right? In that sense, there's a delegate line of reasoning there that I said I would do A, B, and C. My folks voted for me to do A, B, and C, and lo and behold, here's legislation on A. Guess what? I'm going to live up to my word and represent my folks as a delegate and tell them, do what I told them I was going to do and vote that way. Um, but that's a minority of issues, right? The majority of issues that come up that a representative is going to have to make a decision on, they probably did not run on those issues when they were running for election. Their party probably has an issue, a platform, a plank in their platform that talks about that, and they will, as a representative, have to consider whether their constituents agree with that platform, whether there's enough need in their party for them to support that platform. But they're going to be exercising a lot of latitude on their own as they make their decision on those particular issues that they haven't made explicit promises on. And in that sense, they may be doing it in a trustee perspective. Um, when a representative is doing both of these actively, right, we refer to that as a politico perspective. In other words, they're being politic about it. They're weighing, right, promises they've made, needs of their party, maybe the needs of the state as opposed to the needs of their district, maybe the needs of the country, right? Instead of what their district is. So, in a sense, right, every new issue is an opportunity for them to re-examine how they're representing the folks they're representing. Um, if they're wrong, that should show up in the next election, right? They should be called to account by the voting populace that they didn't follow through in the way they should have. So this type of representation we're talking about is representation based on a perspective of what their job is and how well they represent based on the issues, based on their promises, based on the party platform. What this is not is an example of demographic representation, which is a different way of looking at things, right? And one that we have to be aware of. It's a different, you could look at this as should, the question that leads you to this is, it would be a question, um, should those folks elected to Congress look and be educated and have the economic background that matches up proportionally with the way the country looks and is educated and has an economic background? That would be demographic representation. If that were the case, we would look at the House and we would look at the Senate, and that would be split pretty fairly between the genders, right? You would see minority groups represented in the seats at about the same percentages that we see in the population. You would see a lot more folks there that were middle income and lower income and not high income if they were demographically representative of the United States. So our Congress does not look that way. It is not demographically represented. And there's there's arguments to be made about whether it should or shouldn't. Any ideas on that? Nope. I'm getting no response. So I guess that's a no. Um, yeah, there's good things to think about there, right? One way or the other. If we required some kind of demographic representation, we would have a lot more minorities, right, helping make laws. Um, I don't know if there's any guarantee that they would make laws that would right, represent the demographic that they're from, right? We see a lot of folks, right, once they get into office, there are a lot more concerns that they're looking at or presented with than just um, does everybody that look like me or have the same background as me want me to do this and this is what I'm going to do, right? That's it's not that simple, right? So I don't know that how much of a difference it would make. I'm sure it would make some, right? If we were just to look at gender and if half of the Senate and half of the House of Representatives were women, it would make a difference. There's no doubt. Whether it would make a difference on any other issues besides women's oriented issues would be we'd have to wait and see. But I imagine it would. Um, you would like, I think, Lauren, I think what we would like to see um, that happen organically in the sense of how it ought to be, right? That um, all of our different demographics would end up being there at an appropriate level because, in a sense, we didn't pay attention to any of them, right? And we voted based on folks that we thought actually represented us the way we wanted, and then it would show up that way. But I mean, obviously, where we started from, right? Everything was really tilted right toward the white landowning free male thing. So it is getting better. We're not there yet, but we are getting closer to seeing that. And the fact that we haven't mandated it, right, means that it's happening based off of the choice of the voters, which means that when it gets there, it's going to be, we're going to have gotten there organically instead of enforced it, and it will just be the norm at that time. I hope it doesn't take another 100 years. And it, we're actually seeing pretty. It's changing quicker than I think would take 100 years. But it's not real fast, that's for sure. Um, but but that's another way to look at democracy is to say that these decision-making bodies should be um, built to demonstrate demographic representation. AOC is a good example. She hits right both as a woman and as from minority heritage, although she is right from upper higher education bracket, right? So um, and I know she has a bachelor's. Does she also have a master's? I know she has a bachelor's in like economics, right? So I mean, um, and college educated is still less than half. So I think, if I recall my numbers right. So in that sense, she's a little above the or in front of the curve on that issue. Um, but she's got a working class background and a lower economic background, right, that she grew up in. So that brings some, and it, you know, obviously the fact that we know this Democratic House member from New York in Texas, she's making some waves, um, which I think is good. Representatives and senators ought to be making waves, right? We should hear more of them, right? We should know more of them because they're speaking out more often, but a lot of them are pretty quiet and in the background. So anyway, there's a couple ways to look at how they do this job, right? They might be doing it on the political representation focus, which is the delegate trustee Politico idea, or we could be looking at it from do they represent demographically. And we can have different expectations of what we're going to get out of these folks. Right now, it's still overwhelmingly male and overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly high educated, right? Higher education, and usually higher income levels, right? Um, so there's a lot of elements of our society that's represented demographically. The other thing that's important to note is that once you win election to Congress, you usually stay there as long as you want, right? Most of the time, incumbents, the term we give to people that are running for reelection, that are right, they're already in office and running for reelection. Incumbents are right have actually really good job security. They win reelection uh, almost all of the time, 9 out of 10 times. And not only do they win 90% of the time, they usually win easily. Most of the folks that are running for reelection, because of the advantages that come with being an incumbent, and because of in some cases, the advantages you get of being from the majority party in your state helps insulate you against the possibility of losing your job. And so we see quite a few folks at that level that have been there for 20, 25, 30 years, right? Some more, right? And so um, once you get there, you're good for a while. Now, there's an argument to be made whether that kind of longevity in a political position like that, a representative position, is good for the country, good for the state, good for the district. Right? We can talk about that, but the fact is, we know that once you get elected, you're there for a while. So, what is it that helps keep you there? What are the advantages you get simply by being an incumbent? The first one is really easy, right? You get recognition, right? You are in your office for 2 years or 6 years before you have to run for reelection, and you can advertise your name and what you're doing that whole time, right? You've got a direct link back to your voters, back to your district, back to your state. And while you're in office, right, you have the ability to mail things out to them, to use your franking privilege, which is free mail rates, right? So you can mail stuff to your constituents. You can email to everybody that's giving you their email addresses. You get to go on TV when you're back home and talk to the news as a newsmaker, and that gets your name out. So you're advertising who you are and what you're doing and how you're helping the whole time you're in office. And that's a huge advantage because most of us, right, when we show up as voters, um, tend to vote for the names that we know and recognize. Now, if you're a member of a political party, you probably know your party members. And so, right, you've learned their names, you're going to vote for them. But if you're not a member of a party, or you're in a state like Texas, which allows you to pick and choose how you go about it as far as party identification, the fact that you've seen somebody representing you, right, on the news, and you know their name, you go into the voting polls, into the booths, and you see their name there, and you're like, well, who are they running against? Who are these other people? You may not even recognize their right competitors. So that ability for however long you've been in office to work on name recognition is a huge advantage. And you've got to remember, an incumbent has already won election once. So they've got all of those people that voted for them the last election that already know who they are. And now they've had 2 years or 6 years to get their name, continually get their name out of other folks as well. A challenger, right, usually not so much, right? The challenger is someone we probably don't know, that probably doesn't have a huge bank account, that is having to, right, actually work just to get us to know who they are, not what they stand for, what they're going to do, just who they are. And that incumbent has already passed that phase. So that's a huge advantage, right? Being able to having already won an election, being able to advertise for the term of your office by using your office and using your position to continually stay in the news and keep people aware of who you are. Lauren, you brought up AOC, right? Um, she just had to run. She just won re-election, right? This last election, um, and she had to work in her district. She had to go back and run right for re-election and put in time and effort there, um, but not as much as somebody that was probably running against her, right? Everybody in her district knows who she is, right? You may like her, you may not like her, but you know who she is, and that's a big advantage, right? The fact that we know who she is tells you how well that advertising is working, right? Um, does that make sense? The advertising idea of this, the name recognition part of it. So the second advantage that an incumbent has running for re-election, and the reason they end up staying there so long, is that they're actually working already for their constituents. So they're generating a history, right? They're delivering services. They're actually representing people already. And so, in that sense, they've got a history of service that they can point back to. They can actually get folks that have called and asked them for help or written them for help that they've helped to speak up for them, right? And say, so and so is is my House member at the U.S. level, and I had this problem. I called their office. They solved the issue for me in a couple of days, and I was taken care of as a constituent, right? And so, running for re-election, you're going to hear them tell those stories, right? You're going to hear those candidates for re-election say, "Hey, here's me doing my job, and I've got this individual who you might know, right, that I helped out, and this individual. And here are all the stories of people that needed help that I represented and helped. And that's the kind of work that I do. I'm concerned about taking care of my constituents. Just talk to them. So they've got a history of solving problems and that they can then claim credit for, right? This is me doing my job. Those are powerful. Those are powerful stories. And if you hear that story from someone other than the constituent, I mean, other than the office holder, you hear it from the constituent, it's an even more powerful story, right? If they're not saying it, but someone's saying it for them, I had this issue, I called up their office, I got listened to, and my problem was taken care of. Um, you know, I'm a real life example of how they're doing their job right. Voters love that. I mean, who doesn't, right? That's where, right, we get all these Yelps and things like that on the internet, right? That's because that word of mouth of actual good work and good representation is worth a lot, right? Um, all the time I'm seeing, right, my neighbors saying, "Hey, I want to do get some work done on my landscaping. Who do y'all recommend?" Right? Well, this is exactly that same kind of thing, right? The work that you put in as an elected representative gives you a history of service to your constituents. And you should make sure that's as well known as can be possibly put out there because it's powerful. Um, you can actually build your name recognition that way, Caitlin. It's expensive, right? Because all elections are at this level are expensive, and so that means you have to be considered a strong candidate for you to be getting that kind of money to back you. If y'all were paying attention to um, the who is it? It's Cornyn was running for re-election to the Senate here in Texas, and he was running against his opponent, who was MJ Hagar, the lady that's a veteran. If you saw any of her ads, she's riding a motorcycle, and right, that's the second time that I'm aware of that she's run against him for that office. And so 6 years ago when she ran, she was new to the scene and was building her name recognition. This time, right, she's such a good run at the office last time. This time she didn't have to waste as much time getting people to know her. She could spend more time on getting them to know what she stood for and what she wanted to do, and spend more time attacking her opponent. A new challenger has to build time getting their name recognition out there. So MJ Hagar this time was right because she ran again, as you point out. She had already gotten some credibility as far as name recognition, right, with the electorate. So yeah, you can do that, but you've got to, right, you can't plan on it in a sense, because a lot of times once you lose, you're done. Right now, she's a strong candidate because she's a middle of the road Democrat with a military background who's well spoken and has roots in the community, and so that kind of works to her favor, and she's got a likability level that's quotient that's pretty high. So the Democratic Party felt real comfortable with her being right their main opponent against Cornyn again. She still didn't win, right? So now she's going to be if 6 more years before Cornyn runs again. The question is she still going to be interested in 6 more years? Is she still going to be considered viable in 6 more years? Is the party going to want to back her up at that point? Is there somebody new going to come along? Right? She may be done. We don't know. But we all know who she is. Right now, the possibility is it's very probable Cornyn is done after 6 years. Right? He's either going to make her president or he's going to quit, and that means we're going to have an open senatorial seat. I believe she did, Lauren, but I'd have to look it up to be sure. I believe she did better this time than she did last time. There were a lot more Democratic votes cast in Texas, and she was a lot more. She had a bigger bankroll, so she had a lot more visibility. So I think she did better. That's my hunch, but I'm not certain. So yes, right, all of that matters. But the fact is that Cornyn is right number 3 or 4 in the Senate. He's in a very powerful position. There wasn't probably many, if any, Republicans thinking about not voting for him because you've got someone there from your party. They've been there a while. They're in a powerful position. They're representing Texas the way Republicans want them to. He's probably was the best case scenario, and it was easier for him to get reelected certainly than it was for Hagar to challenge him. And he had name recognition. He had service, right? Credit that he could claim, right? And she couldn't do that. The third thing here that's an advantage is that incumbents have a voting record, right? They've been taking positions on issues for the whole time that they've been in office. They've been called, right, to vote. So they can use that, especially if they've been careful to make sure that when they cast those votes, they line up with their constituents, their party, their platform, right? They can point back at that and say, look, here are the promises I made. I told you on these issues I would vote this way. Here are those issues where they came up for a vote, and here's me fulfilling my promise and voting that way. So they can point at that history of position taking as right an example that they are living up to their word, representing their constituents the way they said they would. And challengers just don't have that. They're not there yet, right? They can tell you what they will do. They can promise you that they will represent a certain way, and they probably are telling you the truth. But that I claim I will do this argument versus I've done this argument is a lot weaker, right? When you've got an incumbent saying, here's my promises and here's me fulfilling them, that's really, really powerful as far as voters behind you, right? even if what you were voting for didn't actually get turned into law, right? You can't ever guarantee that what you're supporting and what your constituents want you to support is actually going to be successful as far as becoming legislation. But if you can follow through and vote the way you promised you're going to, that's still a position that you can lay out that you're doing your job the way you're supposed to and that you're representing folks the way you said you would. The last advantage that an incumbent has is a little bit of a backwards argument, right? A backward looking argument, but we'll get there. And it's that incumbents generally have weak opponents. MJ Hagar was probably not in this category, so we couldn't use that example. But most of the time, right, when someone's thinking about challenging an incumbent for a position, they know something, right, that we all know now, and it impacts their decision. And let me back up. It is this right here, right? They know incumbents win 90% of the time. So if you're wanting to run for office and you've got a 10% chance of winning because you're going to run it against an incumbent, that's not very good odds. And if you have a lot of people that were supporting you for that position, you might want to wait until you can run for office when you're running, when the seat is empty, right? You don't want to be in the position of having to use all of your money, all of your support, all of your effort to try to overcome the advantages that an incumbent has. So that if you have time on your side, and this might be MJ Hager, she's fairly young, she has time on her side. If she's looking at it now like Cornyn is not going to run for re-election in 6 years, and I'm young enough to still be there in 6 years, she's got a much better chance of winning in 6 years than she had this year, right? Because she was running against an incumbent. In 6 years, if Cornyn doesn't run for re-election, she will be running against someone else who is not an incumbent, and she'll be a much stronger candidate. The people that choose to run against an incumbent often believe they only have that one shot to do it. And so they're rolling their dice, throwing all their eggs in the basket, and they're giving it a shot, even against these odds. So that means, by definition, they tend to be weaker opponents. They know, right, the constraints that are against them. They know the hurdles they've got to overcome, but they're still willing to gamble that, to take that risk. Whereas better opponents might be getting the advice to just wait another 2 years, wait another 6 years, right? And let's get you running for an open seat instead of against an incumbent. So obviously, if you can, that's what you would rather do. And so those that can afford to wait, those that have time on their hands and have backers that are going to wait for them to run on open seat, those folks are going to be stronger opponents when they do run. It's going to be the weaker opponents, the more desperate opponents that choose to run against an incumbent. Now, sometimes you just run because your party needs somebody to run against the other party's incumbent, and you're the best they got, and they're willing to back you, and so you give it a run. But you got to be careful that losing doesn't taint your name or taint your opportunity, right? I mean, the reason you don't want to be a loser, right? That's if you can avoid that, you want to. So you should pick and choose your battles, and in this sense, the weaker opponents generally choose to pick going now versus waiting. Does that make sense? Throw all of those things together, and you can see why 9 out of 10 times incumbents get reelected, right? So now there is some of a movement floating around in the states to start trying to enact term limits. right? Like for the presidency, right? So if and that would be a way of forcing turnover, right? And there would be more offices coming open more often, giving challengers on both sides of the aisle more opportunities. And a lot of people like that because they think the turnover is going to just, it'll get new people there and new people will make better decisions for a lot of different reasons. There's good reasons for turnover. There's good reasons for having experienced people there as well. So it's half a dozen one, six of the other. All right. So if incumbents win 9 out of 10 times, how do you actually defeat them? And the answer is you usually don't. Um, Incumbents have to really kind of beat themselves in a sense. They have to defeat themselves. They have to do something that puts them on the defensive. And scandal is the best thing, right, for making this happen. So if you've got an incumbent that has done some things that are questionable, is getting drugged through the mud in the papers or something, maybe that's when you run against them. If you're going to run against an incumbent, you run against one that's got some scandal, right? You run against one that's got some problems. Um, and the more tawdry a scandal can be, the better it is for you as a challenger, right? Um, and we almost every election campaign, especially at the national level, uh, attempts are made to induce scandals, right? Attempts are made to uncover scandals and to pull your opponents down by making sure something that's questionable comes to light that maybe people know because scandal is successful. Bad press can be powerful in damaging someone's run for reelection. Um, Although you got to question the effectiveness of scandal the last 4 years, right? We've got a president that was able to keep the one elected after having scandalous things leaked put out by him, was able to keep getting things done they wanted to do in office while continually being exposed to scandal. But maybe it caught up with him in this election, this reelection campaign. Um, but we've seen right incumbents before overcome scandal. Um, that's the best way to get someone out of the way, though, is to uncover a story about them that makes a difference. One of the most effective scandals that took a candidate completely out of the running was when um, was it Reagan Mondale or Bush Mondale? Now I'm drawing a blank. Walter Mondale was the challenger from the Democratic Party for president, and the Republican Party dug up some scandalous results on him from when he was in office before, not as president, but in another office. And he had, it's referred to as the Willie Horton incident. Willie Horton was, if I remember the facts right, a convicted murderer, and he was released from prison, right, because of this. And so that's Dukakis, right? That was Dukakis. Dukakis released him from prison, I think, and so that got hung around his neck as that he was soft on crime. Now, he hadn't done anything scandalous, but the Republicans uh, managing the election were able to make it appear scandalous, and it caused a problem. Another example of an actual scandal where an incumbent defeats themselves is Gary Hart and Donna Rice. Have I talked to y'all about the Gary Hart and Donna Rice? Um, it's one of my favorites because you couldn't shoot yourself in the foot more perfectly than Gary Hart did. Gary Hart was um, out of Colorado. He was running for the Democratic nomination for president. So he wasn't an incumbent, but he was a well-known politician. He had high name recognition. He was kind of considered the favorite by everybody going in, right? So he had all of the elements of being an incumbent, and that he was, well known, a history of serving in government. People liked him. He was photogenic, and I'm going to kick over here real quick and see if I can't find this for you. I don't know that do I have that. I don't have that here. Let me do this. Let me look this up. Whoops. Yeah. So this is Gary Hart and Donna Rice. Gary Hart again, from Colorado, running for president, one trying to get the Democratic nomination for president, and there was scuttlebutt, right? Scuttlebutt that he was maybe not as faithful, right? Y'all can make sure, yeah, not as faithful as he ought to have been to his wife. And he was asked about it, right? He was asked if this was true, and he basically said, no, it's not true. Rumors are false. I'm faithful to my wife. And then he challenged them. He challenged the media to find something. He goes, go out and look for it. You're not going to find anything. It took him about a week before this photo showed up. The lady on his lap is not his wife. That's Donna Rice. And my favorite part of this is the T-shirt. Is my favorite part of this, right? Because I don't know if you can read it real well, but it says "Monkey Business Crew," right? Which is just so perfectly apropos. That's the boat in Miami, if I remember right, it was Miami, that him and Donna Rice were spending the weekend on. The boat was called Monkey Business. And that monkey business, he was done, right? He was done. This got broke, right? And he had that's all the scandal we needed, right? He was history. So that's how you kill yourself, right? That's how you right get in trouble, right, and damage your own campaign. So you hope when you're running for election, right? You hope um, that's the case. That's what they do, right? That an incumbent will do something, or a front runner in this case, not an incumbent, will do something to damage uh, their own campaign, and that's what Gary Hart did, right? So um, that's always fun, right? Yeah, and so if you're a challenger, you hope for that, right? That's that way of getting an incumbent out of the way, is that they do something different. We have tons and tons of examples of that we could look up where somebody's running for office, the media starts digging into their history, or there was a U.S. House representative flying back to Minnesota, got caught in the airport trying to solicit same-sex encounters, right? You're done. You're done. There was it the governor of South Carolina? married and carrying on a relationship with a lady from Brazil, I want to say. Ended up divorcing his wife, not getting elected, went down to Brazil, married her, came back, and I think got elected into office a term or two later, if I remember correctly. So that's the other thing about politics is that sometimes you can redeem yourself from these kind of things. So, but scandal's a good way, right? If your incumbent's in trouble and you're a challenger, that's the time to run, right? When they're in trouble, run against them. Um, that's a good way to overcome all of those advantages. Another way that incumbents tend to lose is of no fault of their own. Um, it's what's called being redistricting out of your district and out of your sport area. Every 10 years at least, right, states redraw their district boundaries based on population shifts. Um, and if you happen to be an elected official from the minority party, you're going to the majority party at the state level trying to redraw your political district's boundaries so that you don't get reelected. So how this happens, right? See if I think I have an example. Um, did I show you all a gerrymandering example of Texas and Lloyd Doggett? If not, I'll go find it real quick. Um, yeah, I think so too. I think I did it in the past, um, where I showed y'all the legislature trying to change Lloyd Doggett's district. He's a Democrat out of Southeast Austin. And so when the Republican legislature in Texas redistricted, they took the district he was in, which had more than enough Democrats to reelect him, and they redrew the boundaries to include more Republicans in his district. And so when he ran for reelection, he had to run in a district that wasn't as friendly to him. He won anyway. And so then they redrew his district again, and he won again, right? So he's right been shot at a couple times now by the Republican majority in Texas as they try to change the makeup of his district so that it wouldn't elect him, it would elect a Republican candidate, and he's been popular enough and successful enough to keep winning. That doesn't always happen, right? When they redraw those boundaries and they pack in, in this case, Republicans into that district, tend to going to vote Republican. And so you lose not because you did anything wrong, not because you're a bad representative, not because you have a scandal, but because the underlying constituent base was changed. And so now you're trying to win election with a constituent base that's you haven't won there before, right? All that advantage that you have as an incumbent is all gone because most of the people there didn't elect you in the past. You haven't delivered service to them, right? They don't care what you did because you're from a different party. So all those advantages, right, kind of go away in the air, and you're kind of a challenger again. And now you might be facing more people from the opposing party. It does seem weird that that's legal. But, right, when we have left up to the states, right, the way to determine how to draw their political boundaries. And most of the states, 37 or so of them, I think, are right. I think it's 30, 35, 37, more than half, let their state legislatures make that decision of how to draw those boundaries, which means the majority party in the state legislature is going to draw those boundaries as much to benefit them as they can within the rules and the procedures of doing that. It's called gerrymandering, and as long as it's done based on political reasoning alone, it's legal. If they start doing it based on race, ethnicity, gender, those are protected classes that you can't base politics on like that. So that is unconstitutional. But as long as they're doing it on just, we're going to pack Republicans in there, That's okay. Um, and the idea behind it is that the way the state decides to do it, as long as right they draw up those laws, and that's right. The people have obviously consented to that because they elected these folks. Those people in the state legislature passed that law. If the people didn't like it, they would have elected somebody different to change those laws, and they didn't. So this is majoritarian democracy working its way out through the state legislatures, and it should have an impact, right, on the politics that are being played out in the state, even if it impacts what's going on at the federal level, right? You want the states to have some control there. And so allowing this is weird, I grant you, but legal. So, and we see people every now and then that lose their districts because they don't have anybody there to vote for them again, in a sense. Most of the time, though, neither of these two things happen. What really gets incumbents out of their seats most often is simply that they decided to do something else, right? They decided to retire. They decided to run for a different office and didn't want to run for reelection. Maybe they died, right, in office. So the vacated seats, right, that are available for turnover, most of them come from choices that are not political in that sense, right? They're just they became empty, right? And so you're as a challenger running for election, your opponent is also a challenger. So there's no advantage in that sense um, because you've already been in office. Now, a lot of times that ability for it to be a vacated seat for you to run against another challenger depends on when the seat became empty. Like in Texas, if a seat becomes empty in the last 6 months to a year before an election, the governor usually has authority to appoint someone to that seat to fill out that minimal amount of term that is left. If there's more than half of the term left, they usually hold a special election to fill it. In that case, you're holding that special election, you will have two challengers. Um, or if it's going to be only empty for a month or 6 weeks or something, you might just let it be empty. Although most governors are going to want to try to get somebody in there so that they have someone from their party in that position representing the party already, getting a little bit of experience and maybe getting a little more name recognition and making them more successful on a bizarre kind of re-election campaign, right? That's only based on 6 weeks of service or something. Governors want to fill those if they can to help their party. So, does this make sense? All right. So that redistricting bit, right? How it is that we keep the House of Representatives fair, in a sense, is based upon redistricting. So there's a requirement in the Constitution that the federal government run a census, which means a counting of all the people in the country. And we're required to do that every decade. So we do that in the even numbered beginning of a decade. So went through a census this year. That census has been completed as far as the field work, and the government is compiling that census right now. And as soon as that information comes out, states will start working on redrawing districts. I was right in between there on the right answer. I said 37, maybe 35, and it's actually 36. Uh, so, right, once the census data is available and we know where everyone in the country is, right, because they said, I'm living here, we know how the population has moved in the last 10 years. And so we will redraw first the number of districts that each state gets based upon population movement and population growth. We've been seeing for the last 20 years a movement of people from the Northeast and the Midwest, South and West. So Texas has been one, getting population from other states that have moved here, and two, our population is growing on its own. And so the number of seats that Texas has, right, is generally growing every decade. States where they're losing population, the number of seats that they have in the House will be shrinking. So we'll figure out how many people we have in the U.S. We'll divide the number of seats, 435 in the House, into that number, and we will try to draw districts that encompass whatever that number is, right? So if we've got 330 million people in the United States and we got 435 representatives, divide 435 into that, and you figure out, right, how many that's going to be. I am not good enough in my head to do that number, but I've got a calculator. So let's say it's 330 million is what the census says end up being in the United States. That could be wrong. Divide that by 435, and you're going to get 758,000 folks per district. So the rules in place say that each U.S. House district should be drawn to have that many people in it, as close as we possibly can. So that's how many people each House member should represent. Any state that has less than that number will get one House member, regardless of how little that number is. So this is how we go about trying to ensure one person, one vote. The equality in voting idea is making sure that the number of people voting in a district is approximately the same from district to district. So each person that gets elected is representing close to the same number. Most states, again, use their state legislatures to do this work, right? So once the U.S. government says, hey, Texas, you get, right, 36 House districts and you got 2 senators, or 36 House districts, you're going to get 36 districts drawn in Texas. I think, and we may go up to 37 or 38. Maybe we have 38 from the House, and so we'll have to redraw our districts to accommodate, right, 38. Some states will lose. So most states do it that way. Those legislatures then reflect what they want to reflect in those districts. As you see here, 5 states use bipartisan committees. So they put a committee together, usually of legislators, but they balance it out between the parties and they let them go off and figure out how to redraw these maps. A couple states use independent commissions. So they pick people that are experts in demographics and experts in demography, and and they put them all together and say, okay, don't be considering one party over the other. Go draw the maps that are going to ensure the best representation for everybody in our state. And then in 7 states, right, they don't have to draw a district because their state's so small in population that their state is the district. So they don't have to worry about it. We do this every 10 years. It reaffects the balance of power in the House at the federal level. Texas, as I've already said, is one of the states that's benefiting from this, right? Because we are growing right now. Any questions about that before we call it a day? Well, we're going to do some gerrymandering next time. Okay, so we'll get there. All right, well, we'll pick up with slide 9 tomorrow.